Seth, so you say that Russia is currently facing its, quote, darkest period since the war began, with its military stalled on the battlefield, losing territory in some areas. In some ways, it feels like we have seen that headline before, and yet Russia continues to hold on.
Yeah, that's the great irony, Erica, is that Russia is losing at historical numbers. Our estimate, 450,000 deaths since the war began in February, and then 1.4 million casualties. To put that in perspective, the U.S. has lost just about 100,000 in all of its wars between World War II and today. So the Russians have lost 4 times those numbers in only 4.5 years. Yet Vladimir Putin continues to fight and to accept those extraordinary fatalities and casualty rates among his forces despite those losses.
And I know there's even among your findings, right? Ukraine, I think, has lost about a third as many troops. Those estimates, though, could even be low because Moscow, I know, routinely underreports casualties. Do you believe there's a chance the actual toll could be even higher than 450,000 for Russia?
I mean, it's possible. Any estimate is an estimate. I mean, we have taken a look at a lot of data and talked to intelligence and government organizations from across Europe and the United States. It is noteworthy that the British intelligence estimate is a little bit higher than ours, closer to 500,000 deaths, which is stunning. So, but I think, our general sense is we're in the ballpark.
In the ballpark. What does it also tell you about the state of this war, right? And how much longer Russia can actually continue, especially with losses of that magnitude?
Yeah, and also, it is worth noting, as we've seen in CNN video clips, that Russian cities are now being routinely hit by drone strikes and long-range missiles. Moscow, St. Petersburg, Crimea, which has been hit. How long can Russia sustain that? That's a very good question. It's one that's impossible to predict. What I will say is Vladimir Putin is feeling the pressure right now, the economic pressure from this war dragging on and the fatalities, which is, I think, why he's looking to respond in some way that, as you noted at the beginning of this segment, President Zelensky is predicting large-scale Russian attacks against Ukraine over the next 24 hours.
So Ukraine, right, under attack in this very moment, right? And Zelensky says they're anticipating ballistic missiles. The drone attacks are already underway. When it comes to the losses for Ukraine, the numbers are smaller, as we noted, about a third. Ukraine's population, though, is also much smaller. Where do things stand for Ukraine at this moment?
Well, Ukraine does face, we call a manpower disadvantage. The Russians have a much larger population, more forces they can draw on, and a much larger population base. The problem Ukraine has is that it has to have this discussion about, does it lower its conscription age right now to something closer to 18, which is where the U.S. was when it was in World War II, for example. Plus, it's struggling with munitions shortfalls as well. So Ukraine has a couple of different problems it's going to have to deal with.
What are the chances that Ukraine sees any additional support coming out of next week's NATO summit?
Well, Erica, that's a good question. I know there's been a lot of discussion from NATO countries, particularly European NATO countries, of continuing to provide more air defense capabilities and more components for drones and missiles, the ones that we're seeing strike Russian targets in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. I think that's going to be a big part of the conversation. How much the U.S. wants to provide, that is a big question mark.
Rescue workers in Kyiv are desperately searching through the rubble in the wake of a massive Russian attack on the capital. The overnight bombardment included nearly 500 drones and more than 70 missiles. It lasted 11 hours and killed 21 people. The attacks came amid a stunning new estimate from this war, now in its 5th year, I'll remind you. Now, the Center for Strategic and International Studies says Russia has suffered a staggering 1.4 million casualties from this conflict, including close to 500,000 dead soldiers. And while the Ukrainian losses are much lower, the numbers are still horrific, with up to 600,000 casualties, including at least 125,000 casualties. We get more now on this latest attack in Kyiv from Nada Bashir.
The moment of impact in yet another round of deadly Russian strikes. The night sky over Kyiv illuminated as fires tear through the city into the early hours of the morning. Hundreds of Russian missiles and drones are said to have been intercepted, but officials say at least 33 made impact, killing more than a dozen people and wounding at least 86 others.
My kids and I wanted to get out of the room. We jumped out of the bed and started running, but there was nowhere left to run. All the windows in the room were shattered and the door was jammed. I couldn't open it.
This latest attack came with some warning. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky calling on civilians to heed the sirens and take shelter in anticipation of an extensive Russian attack. More than 50,000 Kyiv residents are said to have packed into metro stations across the city Wednesday evening, preparing for a long night. Russia's defense ministry claims precision weapons were used to target Ukraine's military and energy infrastructure. But local officials in the capital have condemned what they've described as significant direct hits on residential buildings across the city. In this Kyiv neighborhood, families wait anxiously for news of their loved ones, as emergency services search through the rubble of destroyed homes for casualties.
A miracle happened here today, thanks primarily to the work of the rescue teams. This is the first time in Ukraine that 7 people have been rescued from under the rubble.
A miracle moment for some, but for others, only grief. Neda Bashir, CNN, in London.
Joining us for more now on these attacks and on the status of this conflict is Vladimir Lov. He was once Deputy Energy Minister of Russia before his reform proposals were completely undone by Vladimir Putin. He's a leading voice opposing Putin's continued rule over Russia, and he joins us now. Good to see you, and thanks for being with us here. I do want to start with the military and strategic point here. Putin's response to Ukraine is fairly predictable, right? If you poke the bear will attempt to bite your head off. But do you believe at this point in time there is any kind of backstop for Putin himself right now, or do you fear that he will just continue to escalate?
Hello, great to be with you again. Definitely Putin is getting into more and more desperate situation because his resources that enable him to continue this war are dwindling. He has a lot of economic troubles at home. There's another round of mass mobilization that is being mouthed because he's short of people at the front lines. And if this mobilization happens, this will have a profoundly negative effect on Russian economy and society, so that's no easy choice. And you see that he's not advancing at the battlefield for quite some time already. The combat is very much stalled, and Russia is not advancing. Plus, we see new developments like successful Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory, taken out also some critical energy infrastructure. There are motives. If Putin continues to wage this war against Ukraine, which seems to be the case, the only traditional pattern that he uses to escalate. So this is what he's trying to do by striking more Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, inflicting horror and pain, and hoping to break the resistance of the Ukrainian nation. But we saw this before. It doesn't work. I don't think there are any reasons to believe that this time it will be successful. However, the horrors unfortunately continue.
Yeah, the picture you're painting is quite bleak. I do want to deal with two different factors in Russia, but let's start with the economy. Some assume that there is a cliff over which that Russian economy can go, or will it continue to stumble along? I know you look into this quite closely. So we've got a depleted budget, we have worsening inflation, and of course we have all of these attacks on the energy, especially the refineries in Russia. Is that having a real effect on the economy and Putin's ability to continue to prosecute this war?
All of this is having a very, very significant effect, and particularly if you look in dynamics, just a year ago, Russia did not envisage the scenario that is happening today, which is economic contraction, even despite some of the windfall from increased commodities prices from the war in the Middle East. Russia's economy is still contracting. We just received the data from May, and it shows continued contraction. We have ballooning budget deficit and a full-blown budget crisis, and we have second highest inflation in G20 after Turkey, and the government was not able to calm it down with 3 years of high interest rates and tight monetary policy. That doesn't mean that Putin does not have resources to continue the war. But his room for maneuver is significantly shrinking. For once, talks about mobilization are being contained with the shortage of labor at the Russian labor market. And that's one of the biggest economic issues which prevents him from mobilizing more men to fight in Ukraine. So economy is now a very significant constraining factor. Putin might still continue to wage war for some time, but if you listen to a Russian public debate that happens even in officials' corridors of power, people begin questioning. Ministers, top businessmen begin questioning what they are doing and openly saying that we need to end the war as soon as possible.
Those elites are clearly the people that matter, perhaps, in having influence on the Kremlin. But I do wonder, going back to your original point, what is the risk of Putin really escalating further here? Because the war is now hitting home for Russians. He may actually gain more support for this war, right? Do you believe it could prompt a certain level of defiance that might convince him, you know what, I'm going to hit back even harder?
Well, you can look at the objective indicators, one of which is recruitment, drafting of people to fight on the battlefield against Ukraine. This drafting has been dramatically shrinking in numbers. Recently, there are not many men left who are willing to go and fight, even for a pay which is many times higher than a median salary in Russian regions. But still, this stream of new recruits is shrinking. That's one thing. Another thing, if you really look at many signs of discontent, some prominent pro-Putin public figures openly speaking against the war, against his policies, that has been increasing lately. I wouldn't go into details, but many numbers, just ahead of Russia's biggest bank, saying the day before yesterday at the annual shareholders meeting that everybody in the country is waiting for a military operation to end. So, difficulties are mounting and there is a cost of war. So if we're speaking about Putin going all out, fully mobilizing the country, the big question is, will there be people who will be willing to join him in this fight? Because the country is extremely exhausted.
Right. You doubt whether or not he could pull it off. I've been following very closely what's been going on in Russia in terms of just the lineups at the gas stations. Now, this is impacting everyday Russians. I know you have seen the lines the way I have seen the lines. There are many gas stations that you and I would have been in front of to try and get gas into our cars. You and I both know it's summer. It is dacha season. This is going to start to rile people in Moscow and beyond. How are Russians feeling about this? Because I know that we have the elites. I know that we have what we see on state television. But in terms of what you know from everyday Russians, even if they're afraid to speak out, is this what's going to do it, the lineups at the gas station?
Everybody is worried about this. This is what all the country has been talking about and buzzing about lately, because we haven't seen that crisis for decades, for a long time, since maybe late 80s or early 90s. But there is a distance. Russia is a full totalitarian country. If you look at, Freedom House ranking, we're in top 20 of worst of the worst, in the range of Eritrea and Iran, probably. It's not very easy for societies in the countries like that to transform their discontent into protest. Takes time, takes multiple factors, not just gasoline, but probably something else and a combination of different things. But things are brewing. One of the issues that we recently saw are pro-Putin public figures openly saying that Putin is to blame and we need to end the war, just in the recent few weeks and months, something unthinkable before. So something is brewing here. We saw that in the previous century several times in Russia, how all of a sudden discontent transforms into political action. We're clearly going there, but don't expect a fast journey from point A to point B, but the process is heating up.
President Zelensky is calling these strikes long-range sanctions, and he is convinced that this is what it takes to bring Putin to the table in earnest. Do you agree with that assessment? Do you think that Putin will now look to bring this war to an end, or will he just double down?
Well, thanks for having me, Bianna. I think it's a big gamble. I mean, obviously the effort by President Zelensky is to make ordinary Russians feel as if this is not a distant, cost-free war for them. And I think when Putin came out the other day and acknowledged the fuel shortages, when those who went to his economic forum in St. Petersburg saw the black smoke rising just across the way from a giant refinery that had been hit. It looks like it was hit by a Russian anti-missile system, but nonetheless was burning and dropping soot all over the city. I think that has been successful. The question is there anything in Putin's DNA or his history that would make you think that this is likely to make him more likely to strike an accord? And I don't know many Russia experts who think that it will. The risk at the other side is literally that he goes nuclear, that we get ourselves back into the kind of situation that we saw in October of 2022, when the U.S. believed there was roughly a 50-50 chance that a cornered Putin at that moment would roll out tactical nuclear weapons and use them against, say, a Ukrainian military base. We haven't seen that since, but I think there is rising risk here.
To that point, David, we know that the Biden administration was very adamant that Ukraine only use weapons provided by the U.S. and the West in a defensive capability and was not in favor of these types of longer-range strikes. And I think the same held for some of the Trump administration as well. But now we're not hearing much at all from the Trump administration. In fact, we are hearing the president praise these deep strikes and the images that he's seeing. I mean, he's known to like winners, right? We remember his reaction to the Hezbollah pager attacks by Israel. Do you think that this is a genuine strategic shift from the president, who has long expressed his frustration and animosity with Zelensky? Or do you think this all changes once Vladimir Putin gets him on the phone again?
I think it shifts, but a few things. First of all, whatever the president's view of it is, since the United States is not now sending weapons directly to Ukraine, instead it's selling some weaponry to Europe, and Europe is then giving it to Ukraine, the U.S. doesn't get the kind of vote that it had during the Biden era, right? Because it's not our stuff. Second, this is being done largely with Ukrainian-made drones and some Ukrainian-made missiles as well. They've obviously stepped up production. They're doing that, some with the help of private American money and private technological help from the U.S. that isn't widely advertised at the time, but it is a very different equation. But it's not risk-free. And when you talk to the Europeans, there is fear that one of Putin's reactions, since he believes that this is largely Europe's fault, will be to take some kind of action beyond Ukraine's borders into NATO territory in the next year or so. We haven't seen any threats of that yet, but it's not an unreasonable guess that he would step up pressure on the Europeans.
But it is still happening with U.S. intelligence providing some of the logistical locations, I would imagine, for these strikes. And that hasn't been cut. We've seen that happen early in this president's, in his second term. That hasn't happened now. Are you hearing that there's any risk of that happening, David?
I've not heard of that, those cuts happening. During the Biden period, from the start of the war on, there was the creation of a joint intelligence center in Germany called the PIT, where American, British, Ukrainian officials met each day and helped identify targets. And we believe that is going on to this day.
And as you note, though, a bigger risk also, not only as it relates to this war between Russia and Ukraine, but what this means for Europe and NATO members there. A lot of reporting suggesting that they are not prepared for this modern day drone warfare specifically, and what happens if the United States is not a player if one of these countries is attacked. So much uncertainty remains, David.